Blood satellite.
To set the stage, there's this article that I had come across, which I found very interesting. A lot of people, I think, had the wrong read on it, but I'll explain why. This is an article I found in VDare, vdare.com. It's concerning a man named Alex Karp, and he's the CEO of an organization called Palantir.
Co-founded by Peter Thiel back in 2003, its mission, providing software that customers use to integrate volumes of data from images to spreadsheets into a central platform where it can then be securely analyzed and interpreted.
News of Palantir's plans to go public, as well as its recent announcement that it will be relocating its headquarters from Palo Alto to Denver, has put the secretive software company in the spotlight. Best known for its work with U.S. government agencies like the CIA, the Department of Defense, and most controversially, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the company was founded following 9/11 with the goal of defending American interests.
The core mission of our company always was to make the West, especially America, the strongest in the world for the sake of global peace and prosperity.
But in recent years, Palantir has also courted customers like Airbus, Chrysler, and BP. Commercial customers now make up about 50% of the company's revenue, a number that's trended upwards over the past decade.
The title here is Palantir CEO Karp. He says, "We stopped the rise of the far right in Europe." Well. Now, this is an article written by A.W. Morgan. It's highly editorialized, so I'm going to try. It's like a zero hedge article where it's kind of like a blog post with a lot of very edgy language sometimes. Let me see here. He says, Alex Karp, the CEO of big tech's globe-straddling software company Palantir. In a recent interview, Karp, the son of a Jewish father and a black mother, claimed that Palantir's software short-circuited the rise of European political parties energized by the Great Replacement and migration of illegal aliens and their subsequent terror attacks. So there's been a lot of people who looked at this article and said, "Oh, look, here's a software CEO saying he tamped down on the popularity of the far right. What could that mean?" Well, what he's actually saying is that their platform called Palantir Gotham, it's a proprietary software they own. He says that software stopped the rise of the far right in Europe because it prevented terrorist attacks from occurring. He says if those terror attacks had happened, you would have a far-right government in every single country in Europe, and especially in the Nordics. The government would be further to the right if not for our products. So a lot of people said...
Hold on. I just want to make sure I totally understand you. His argument is that he prevented the rise of the right wing by preventing terror attacks perpetrated by immigrants and left-wingers.
Exactly, yes.
Holy... I didn't even get that part of the story, because the way the headlines all read is he's preventing right-wing terror attacks. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a total flip of what people think it is, because the software you'd think, oh, and that's also for suppressing right-wing thought. No, he's preventing terrorist attacks, which the right wing would be responding to. However, he sees stopping the far right as the main goal, not stopping the terror attacks. Damn. Which is interesting. However, it isn't. I just found that, his business interesting because he's on the cover of Forbes right here. Here's the title: How a Deviant Philosopher Built Palantir, a CIA-funded data mining juggernaut. And it's got his big smiling mug there with his big frizzy hair. It says "Meet Big Brother." So basically, the software he runs is a data mining software, and he works for the CIA. It says Palantir isn't just another big tech behemoth. In 2013, Forbes profiled the company, which rumor had it helped track and kill Osama bin Laden. U.S. government intelligence agencies, specifically the CIA, thought its non-profit venture capital operation InQtel funded the company. The company's ability to decode and trace data, and people like Counterterrorism, 24 even worries the deep state friendly American Civil Liberties Union. So basically this is like what the CIA uses to track people online, and it seems to have reached a level of power that worries even other government agencies, because it's this one guy, right?
Yeah.
But it is interesting. What I liked about this was people are trying to, when you see a title like that, there's a lot of confusion with people because you're trying to parse the difference between what is the speech being profiled versus what are the actions being seeked out to try and prevent. And like, what is social media? What is this software? Is the software integrated into the social media? Everything is all tangled up. Like, what is the actual goal here? Is the goal to stop terrorists, or is it to stop the real enemy, which you might see as an ideological movement that could be triggered by these actions? And I really wanted to just talk about that because it's sort of the merging of content and media and software and individuals and stuff, which leads us into our discussion of the book, which I'm very, very excited about. The book is titled Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man by Marshall McLuhan. Now, this is a book we've mentioned a couple times in the past. In a couple previous episodes, we would have mentioned hot and cold media. This was the guy who coined the term "the media is the message." We talked about a lot of little ideas in this book, like one about the utility of time. I'm going to try, I might skip over some of those parts we've already discussed, but there's actually a lot to talk about in this book. Marshall McLuhan is a towering figure in that sphere, but he's very related to Harold Innis, who we talked about with Empire Communications. In fact, a lot of his ideas built off of Innis's ideas. It was funny that I was reading on both of these figures, and there's sort of this almost a hipsterish idea that McLuhan is like the sellout version, and like if you're a real communications guy, you like Innis, and McLuhan's like a fucking hack, you know. But what's interesting about this book is it's like equal parts history and philosophy and metaphysics and media analysis, and that's what's so interesting about the book. Like, it weaves between all these ideas. Some people would think that it's a bit too flowery. Some people would think it's a bit too esoteric, but it's talking about like the impact that media has on the human psychology and also human history, and how it changes how we think. That's basically what the idea is about, like media as an extension of man, because our relationship with media, the claim that he's making, the relationship between the media isn't just like we are an individual and we view things. That's how some people think of it. Like, oh, you view a screen, you use a language. Like, it's a very utilitarian way that they view how we interact or apprehend media. And he's taking a much more metaphysical approach, one that I think is more correct. That, you know, in short, the development and utilization of different forms of media changes how you think.
Every technology has its own ground rules, as it were. It decides all sorts of arrangements in other spheres. The fact of script and the ability to make inventories and collect data and store data changed many social habits and processes back as early as 3000 BC. However, that's about as early as scripts began. The effects of rearranging one's experience, organizing one's experience by these new extensions of our powers, are quite unexpected. Perhaps one way of putting it is to say that writing represents a high degree of specializing of our powers.
Yes.
Compared to pre-literate societies, there is a considerable concentration on one faculty when you develop a skill like scripting.
And this is the visual, what you call the visual.
Yes,
faculty.
this is a highly specialized stress compared to anything in ordinary oral societies. There have been many studies made of this in various ways. But in our own Western world, the rise of the phonetic alphabet seems to have had much to do with Platonic culture and the ordering of experience in the terms of ideas, classifying of data and experience by ideas.
And it also changes like the content of the message. Because when I was in college for marketing, you know, I had a professor who claimed to read McLuhan, and people would say, you know, the medium is the message. And he thought he was very clever and says, you know, I thought about that. And I thought, you know, the message is the medium. And he just flipped it. And he's like, that was supposed to be his stamp on it. I'm like, well, first of all, just flipping it means the same thing, really. Like, you're not being clever. Yeah. But also, like, most people who say the medium is the message haven't drilled all the way down to the bottom. It's actually a very, very complex idea. I'm going to read from a lot of what's in the book. I'm going to bounce around a lot, but it's all really fascinating stuff. And it all builds off of what we talked about before, especially with Innes, the relationship with the types of media. If you'll recall from Innes, we were talking about how communication can be optimized for time or optimized for space. And usually the center of power, the government, whatever it might be, it prefers communication that's optimized for time, things that last a long time. Whereas those in the periphery, the people on the outskirts, they prefer communication that's optimized for space. And all throughout time, this would be like the adoption of like statues and carving that the governments use versus papyrus, which degrades faster, but it can move further. It can be reproduced faster. You can get messages lightning fast, or at least comparatively to what the center of power is using. And usually, as the center of power adopts that form of media, it inspires the creation of another type of media. So, just to rehash that, what you would see was the popularity of paper being used by the people. Eventually that becomes the centralized publishing industry. So now the only people who really produce manuscripts and paper are those aligned with the publishing industry or power or government. And then on the periphery, what are we all using? The internet. We're using memes. Like we are like anti-paper, and as the centers of power are trying to adopt that too, the question is, what do we adopt that can be optimized for space as they try and like wrestle this very fluid, agile media into something more permanent, because that's not what we like. We like things that are a bit more fluid and exciting and energetic. That's the type of thing that the people in the periphery tend to innovate. And that's just been seen across time. So, but he says, the medium of the message, this is in McLuhan here, the medium of the message is to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, and a medium is really just an extension of ourselves, result from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. So he's saying like every type of media is kind of an extension of the human body. And by media, he includes a lot of different things in media. And there's a few things I might disagree with McLuhan on. And I've talked to some people about this. People who like McLuhan tend not to really debate too much about it. But there's a few things in the book I didn't like. One is that he would say also like the wheel is a media. The wheel, it's supposed to be an extension of like our feet to allow transport to be faster. Language itself is a media to give a different form to our thoughts. But when we think of media, we think radio, TV, internet, things like that. Well, really, what these are, they're technological extensions of ourselves.
The whole world of teenage dress is a world of icon in one hand, in the sense that they stress all sorts of images with strongly marked bounding lines. But these images, the costumes that they prefer, are the ones that highlight role-playing rather than individual identity. They would rather be involved, well, for example, a judge with a wig doesn't represent any private entity whatever. He is a role, a function in the whole society. The surgeon in his white coat, the scientist in the white coat, this is role-playing, and this appeals deeply to the young, the teenager type. The wearing the long hair, the beards and so on, this suggests involvement in depth in role. And it's not a private identity so much as a corporate one.
And so when you kind of extend ourselves by these media, it changes how we use them. It changes how we think. It changes like how we interact with the world. And he actually makes a point that you kind of numb yourself by extending yourself. But that's why in the title he says the extensions of man, that there's the man as just sort of this corporeal biological entity, and then the tools and the ways we use to extend ourselves with language and with ideas all kind of branch out from us. And the types of message that are branched off with are fundamentally attuned to what that type of media is. And what he focuses on mainly in the book is the electric age, the modern era, because he says electricity was really what blew everything apart. And a lot of people don't really think about it like that. Like they think their relationship with electricity is just, it's power. It's just power. We've always had a concept of power. This is just faster. He's like, no, you don't understand. Like what electricity the very concept of electricity and electrical power introduced was the idea of instantaneous things. Like, one example is like the human being. Like, we had a very rigid understanding of process. Like, A leads to B, leads to C, and that was kind of the Industrial Revolution, the mechanization of a process. But he's like, once you introduce to the public the idea of like an instantaneous network, like you flick a switch and everything turns on, like, that's a new way of thinking about things. Like, you couldn't think about a complex matrix in the 1700s. You had to kind of go through the fire of like the electrical revolution to see the world outside of just simple ABC processes. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here, because he says here, in the electrical age, when our nervous system is technologically extended to the whole of mankind and to incorporate the whole of mankind within us, we necessarily participate in depth in the consequences of every action. It is no longer possible to adopt the aloof and disassociated role of the literate Westerner. So he's saying, what electricity really did was it created these power, created like the radio and things like that, and that gave us a type of instant connectivity, which kind of shattered the old paradigm, and the idea that you could kind of exist in your own little space is gone forever. That just doesn't. We can try and live like that. We can idealize the life of a hermit, but he says like the transition to where like the Western man could immediately apprehend the entire world at once is like that was a transition that there's no going back from.
Involuntarily, we're getting rid of individualism. We're in a process of making a triumph. For just as books and their private point of view are being replaced by the new media, so the concepts which underlie our actions, our social life, are changing. We are no longer so concerned with self-definition, with finding our own individual way. We're more concerned with what the group knows, of feeling as it does, of acting with it, not apart from it.
Look, let's back up just a bit, Marshall.
No.
If more books are being used, more being sold, the libraries are crowded, they're busy, how can it be said, aside from what else may be happening, that we're moving out of a print culture?
As John said, books are still very important, but their role is changing. The nature of their importance is changing. Remember that books were our first teaching machine, and during the Renaissance, our only teaching machine. Books are what gave the Renaissance its peculiar stamp. We had to see the world and each other's through the printed line on the page. And today, there are many media of information, many teaching machines.
He says, here, our conventional response to all media, namely that it is how they are used that counts, is the numb stance of the technological idiot. For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. The effect of the medium is made strong and intense just because it is given another medium as content. So it's like, like speech is giving content to the mind. Like the medium is like a delivery system for another thing. The content of writing or print is speech, but the writer is almost entirely unaware either of print or of speech. And he said the stepping up in speed from the mechanical to the instant electric form reverses explosion into implosion. Until recently, our institutions and arrangements, social, political, and economic, had shared a one-way pattern. We still think of it as explosive or expansive, though it no longer obtains, we still talk about the population explosion and the explosion in learning. It is the fact that everybody in the world has to live in the utmost proximity created by our electric involvement in one another's lives. Electricity does not centralize, but decentralizes. I thought that was an interesting way of putting it. And he says later on in the book, he said, it has the unique effect that literacy as a media, like the language, the written language as a medium, had the effect of creating individuality. That you could ascertain information and kind of focus on something as an individual, and it just kind of introduced you to the atomized experience. And he said what electricity did for the Western mind was almost retribalize it, because for the longest time the Western mind was more individualistic. But he says we don't really have that luxury anymore. We are in a process of retribalization through this simultaneously awareness, through all the media granted to us by electricity. And this has the most profound effect on the Western mind, because he said there's other cultures out there which are already universalistic in nature. And he had made a good point. He said, like when the radio is introduced to the West, we can enjoy the radio as like a one-to-one experience. But if you introduce like the radio to an oral culture that doesn't have the written language, he says it's like an atom bomb going off for them. So different media has different effects on different types of minds in different types of cultures. And the media is represented by technology. And that's kind of what I was getting at with the Palantir thing, which is social media is such a fascinating development, because we think of social media and we just think of platforms. We just think, oh, this is a place where people talk, kind of. But what it really is a media in itself. It is a media that is carrying complex social interaction as like a form in itself. Like that was like our own atom bomb. Social media, in a sense, was almost the retribalization of the Western mind and thrusting us back together. Whereas before, everything, like in the Industrial Revolution, everything is specialized. Everyone has their place, everyone has their function, and then it's through electricity and through constant exposure, it's like forcing us together and like recreating this idea that like we're all connected, not even in like a hippie sort of way, but it's like we're all aware and all connected to each other at the same time, and we don't really like it. It's an alien feeling to us. We still rebel against it, but that's like, this feeling is what most tribes feel at all times. Like we're experiencing what a lot of oral cultures feel at all times, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it.
You predicted that the world was becoming a global village.
We're going back into the bicameral mind, which is tribal, collective, without any individual consciousness.
But it seems, Dr. McLuhan, that this tribal world is not friendly.
Oh no, tribal people, one of their main kinds of sport is sort of butchering each other. It's a full-time sport in tribal societies.
But I had some ideas. We got global and tribal. We were going to become.
The closer you get together, the more you like each other.
Yeah.
There's no evidence of that in any situation that we've ever heard of. That when people get close together, they get more and more savagely impatient with each other.
Well, why is that? Because of the nature of man, or
his tolerance is tested in those narrow circumstances very much. Village people aren't that much in love with each other.
Like we're no more prepared to encounter radio and TV in our literate milieu. By literate, what I was talking about before, about just like the strict one-to-one, rationalistic reader mind, then the native of Ghana is able to cope with literacy that takes him out of his collective tribal world and breaches him into individual isolation, which is more familiar to the Western mind. And like I'll say one thing that I disagreed on the book, and some people can push back on this before. He had said that, and this is an interesting thing to say, but he had said that like literacy in a sense is almost a prison. Like there's many times in the book where he talks about the more universalist oral cultures as if they're superior. And I think we might have talked about this before, but there's this idea of the cognitive trade-off hypothesis. The cognitive trade-off hypothesis is this idea that when great apes, human ancestors, they had higher cognitive abilities to do more mental calculations. They were lacking literacy, they were lacking individual, but they could view the jungle, they could view what was going on and do more impressive instant calculations based on what they were seeing. And as we gained literacy, as we gained more advanced communications, we lost those cognitive faculties. And so in that sense, he would say like, oh, the oral cultures, like they're able to think on their feet more. They're maybe better to adapt to situations. And there are a few times in the book where he makes it sound like the literate mind was like we were domesticated by words, or we're lesser because of our literate minds. And I just disagree with that. And he also made a point in the book that he said that the Japanese mind was able to retribalize more than the Western mind. And that's because the Western mind had literacy for much longer. And if you look it up, the Japanese written Japanese language is, I think, only a couple centuries later than the earliest, Anglo-European languages. So like, I don't know, there's little things like that where I think he's reaching, where he says, oh, obviously the Japanese can retribalize and get a more universal thing. It doesn't matter. Like, we're both equally literate, or we both had a written language for around the same amount of time. Anyway, there might be some ways you can pick that apart, because maybe the Japanese language is a bit more pictorial. I don't know. But that's just one thing that I disagree with. I welcome people to push back on that. And like he was saying here, specialist technologies detribalize. The non-specialist electric technology retribalizes. Myth is the contraction or implosion of any process, and the instant speed of electricity confers the mythic dimension on ordinary industrial and social action today. We live mythically but continue to think fragmentarily and on single planes. You kind of see what I'm talking about. Like, this is a direct quote from the book. He speaks in very esoteric mythological language. Some people like that. I like that. I can see why that might be difficult for some people. I'm also taking like huge chunks and also reading them, so maybe some of this needs proper build-up, but I'm trying to collect these ideas as succinctly as I can, because there's quite a bit to cover, and I want to make sure I give it its due, even though we've talked about it before. He says, here's a line here. The electric implosion now brings oral and tribal ear culture to the literate West. Not only does the visual, specialist, fragmented Westerner have now to live in the closest daily association with all the oral cultures of Earth, but his own electric technology now begins to translate the visual or eye man back into the tribal pattern with its seamless web of kinship and interdependence. That's how he views the tribal cultures. It's that web of kinship and interdependence, which he seems as superior, which many people on our side would see superior. And this is something I've remarked on before, where I've said, I don't think the Western man, the European descended man, or the European man broadly, can collectivize like the Eastern man can. Like, a lot of, especially like the socialist types on our side, they'll look to China, they'll look to the East and say, why can't we collectivize like them, like be a hive mind like them? And I just don't think
different.
Yeah, it's not in the cards for us.
Gene culture coevolution. It doesn't work with Anglos and other Westerners.
And he says here, and this is kind of what I was talking about, he says, literacy creates very much simpler kinds of people than those that develop in the complex web of ordinary tribal and oral societies. For the fragmented man creates the homogenized Western world, while oral societies are made up of people differentiated not by their skills or marks, but by unique emotional mixes. So that's something that's a direct quote. And that's something I take a bit of exception to. But it's interesting when he talks about, really what we're all talking about right here still is the explosion of awareness granted by electricity. And one example he gives is cubism. What is cubism? The art form cubism. Cubism, he says, by seizing on instant and total awareness, suddenly announced that the medium is the message. Because cubism is seeing all angles at once. It's trying to maximize in a single plane how many dimensions you can see simultaneously. He says, is it not evident that the moment that sequence yields to the simultaneous, one is in the world of structure and configuration, specialized segments of attention have shifted to the total field, and we can now say the medium is the message quite naturally. And I do think that is true. I do think, I don't think that's really been discussed. And that to me is like the core interesting thing here, that we still, even on the dissident right, but in society, we still tend to think in industrial revolution terms, in processes. And we haven't really noticed that the way we think about things is in terms of networks, in terms of matrices. Like we were just talking about before, about how children build their minds. Like in the past, in the 1700s, they would have a completely different understanding of how a child builds their cognitive faculties, but it seems quite obvious to us that they're building an interdependent matrix and generating it with complexity in many different directions at once. It's not A to B to C to D, it's not just, and I think that is, I've mentioned this before, I think in popular culture and in the zeitgeist, that can explain why we're so fascinated with multiverses right now. Even like the dumbest person can understand what a multiverse is and understand that multiverses can interact with each other and fuck with not only time linearly, but multiple linearities of time. You know what I mean? Like, that's a really fucked up concept, you know, but we're making children's cartoons about that. I think that comes with our understanding of like the simultaneous existing in stasis. Like, even that fucking movie The Flash that came out recently, if you look at The Flash, for those who've seen it, it's kind of a complex idea. By the end of it, it's like there's all these timelines that branch out, and he's trying to visit each timeline to save his mother, and he becomes like this evil, sick, deranged mutant as a result because he can't get it right. He can't run all the calculations. So it's a story of a man who's almost trying to like understand at once like the complexity of the quantum world and also conflicting timelines, and how he with his human mind just can't get it right. That's a really modern story. That's a really fucked up, weird story for kids, but that's a story we can tell now because we have this understanding. That's the evolution of cubism that he's talking about. He explains, now that we talk about the medium as the message we talked about before, hot medium and a cold medium. People might have heard that before. Well, what does that mean? What's a hot medium? What's a cold medium? So a hot medium is one, and this relates directly to what we were saying about extensions, extending your senses. So he says a hot medium is one that extends one single sense in high definition. High definition is a state of being well filled with data. So it's like watching a movie, watching something visually that totally apprehends your visual awareness, and it doesn't demand your participation. You would say like cool medium would be one that demands a lot of participation. It's not overloaded with data. A telephone is a cool medium, or one of low definition, because it's you need to interact with it for it to function. You need to almost give it its information for it to do something. A statue would be a cool medium because you have to like approach it and kind of fill in the gaps yourself. It's not something you can just sit in front of and it like bombards you with information like a movie would, or radio would. Radio is probably a better hot medium because it dominates your ear, and it kind of like hijacks your ear and makes you imagine things. He said, on the other hand, hot media do not leave so much to be filled in or completed by the audience. Hot media are therefore low in participation, and cool media are high in participation or completion by the audience.
But you may have seen a New Yorker joke. A couple are watching TV, and one says, when you think of the vast educational potential of TV, aren't you glad it doesn't? Mm-hmm. This is based on the assumption, you see, that it's the content that does the educating, not the media. Now, if it should be just the other way around, and very few people have asked themselves anything about that, then it would be understandable why these things happen involuntarily and unasked.
Well, but how far can we push this? I mean,
let's push it all the way.
Peyton Place. If you put on Peyton Place, or if you put on a news documentary. Now, the contents are radically different in that case. But still, from your point of view, the medium is transcending the contents in significance, so far as the person out there is concerned.
It's like changing the temperature in a room. It doesn't matter what's in the room at all, or what pictures are on the wall, or who's in the room. If the temperature drops 40 degrees suddenly, the effect on our outlook, our attitudes, profound.
And what's interesting now, if you think about that, if you take that, when this was written in the mid-20th century, think about how, you could do this at home, think about how that's been all twisted up by like the relationship between the media we consume and our participation in it. Because that, like, what's online streaming except for that? It's, people wonder why streaming is so popular. It's because you took something that was a hot medium, television, and made your participation part of it. Like, the line between audience and creator in the current paradigm is completely blurred. And this is what we were talking about even with the Palantir thing. Like, it's difficult to decide who's a content creator, who's participating in the content, who's viewing the content. Is viewing the content part of it? People are making content about content they view. Like, it's all tangled up right now. And that's like, everything's kind of becoming cooled in that sense. There's not a lot of media that just completely hijacks your vision and like demands your attention. The closest you'd get are movies, but you know, black people figured it out that you can make a movie a cool media by just talking. Here's an interesting thing he says about the extension of ourselves into media. He says, any extension of ourselves they regard as auto amputation, and they find out that the auto amputative power or strategy is resorted to by the body when the perceptual power cannot locate or avoid the cause of infiltration. Basically saying that when you kind of extend one of your senses, you kind of like numb yourself because it makes it more sensitive. The principle of numbness comes into play with electric technology as with any other. We have to numb our central nervous system when it is extended and exposed or we'll die. He says, thus the age of anxiety and of electric media is also the age of the unconscious and the apathy. So that's an interesting way of looking at it, that as we've granted ourselves so much connectivity through electrical connections, through social media, through all these communications, we've actually numbed ourselves to the experience of that communication. And I think that's probably a lived reality for a lot of people. Like, you probably have more human connections now than any of your ancestors did. And that we were talking about that the other day in the chat. We're talking about how people don't have, Zoomers struggle to have relationships. Gen Alpha struggles to have relationships. I'm like, well, do they? It actually seems, even millennials, like no one's talking to each other. It's like, no. Well, then what's hookup culture? It actually seems that there's a problem with making too many connections, that those connections are effectively numbed, and that our interactions with people is like feels amputated. Even sex, meeting online, we're having more sex than ever before, but everyone's more miserable because the human connection through these electric means has we've got total awareness, but that's totally numbed us as a result. That's more the case that he's making there. I think there's a lot of truth to that. He makes a point that's not even really avoidable. He says, to behold, use, or perceive any extension of ourselves in technological form is necessarily to embrace it. To listen to radio or to read the printed page is to accept these extensions of ourselves into our personal system and to undergo the closure or displacement of perception that follows automatically. By continuously embracing technologies, we relate ourselves to them as their servo mechanisms. That's a line and a half. Just by putting our physical bodies inside our extended nervous systems by means of electric media, we set up a dynamic by which all previous technologies that are just extensions of our hands and feet and teeth and the body heat control systems, because he would include clothing as a type of media too, will be translated into information systems. Under electric technology, the entire business of man becomes learning and knowing. In terms of what we still consider an economy, this means that all forms of employment become paid learning, and all forms of wealth result from the movement of information. And this was written in the mid-20th century, so I think that seems to have come to fruition pretty accurately. I'll just read this. I'm going to read a bunch of paragraphs that I just thought were interesting, and hopefully people can follow along with this. He says, the new media and technologies by which we amplify and extend ourselves constitute huge collective surgery carried out on the social body with complete disregard for antiseptics. I like that part. Highly relevant to Western man is Toynbee's explanation of how the lame and the crippled respond to their landscapes in a society of active warriors. So how do crippled people respond in a warrior society? They become specialists. And how do whole communities act when conquered and enslaved? They specialize and become indispensable to their masters. It is probably the long history of human enslavement and the collapse into specialism as a counter-irritant that have put the stigma of servitude and on the figure of the specialist even in modern times. The capitulation of Western man to his technology, with its crescendo of specialized demands, has always appeared to many observers of our world as a kind of enslavement. To a much greater degree than Roman slavery, the specialism of mechanized industry and market organization has faced the Western man with the challenge of manufacture by monofracture, or tackling of all things in operations one bit at a time. And he contrasts this against the tribal man. He says tribal cultures cannot entertain the possibility of the individual or of the separate citizen. Their ideas of spaces and times are neither continuous nor uniform, but compassional and compositional in their intensity. Oral cultures act and react at the same time. Phonetic culture endows men with the means of repressing their feelings and emotions when engaged in action. So that's sort of like the universalism of being that we don't have access to, which we're kind of re-emerging into now. And how does that function work? Well, he goes into a bit more detail. He says the written word spells out in sequence what is quick or implicit in the spoken word. That's why reading is so mentally taxing compared to speaking. It is the extension of man in speech that enables the intellect to detach itself from the vaster, wider reality. Language does for intelligence what the wheel does for the feet and the body. It enables them to move from thing to thing with greater ease and speed and ever less involvement. As an extension or uttering or outering of our senses at once, language has always been held to be man's richest art form. It can be argued then that the phonetic alphabet alone is the technology that has been the means of creating civilized man, the separate individuals equal before the written code of law. And this is kind of the thread that's been going through a lot of the past few episodes and the next one as well, when we discuss the concept of logos, about the relevance and the importance of the written word, not just in as a form of communication, but how you actually define yourself and find your place within reality. Like the Western man, compared to the oral tradition or the ancient man, can actually position himself differently in reality than they could. Like they can't even understand the concept of a man apart from nature, which is why it's so difficult to deal with them now. He says, to sum all this up, pictographic and hieroglyphic writing as used in Babylon, Mayan, and Chinese cultures represents an extension of the visual sense for storing and expediting access to human experience. All of these forms give pictorial expression to oral meanings. As such, they approximate the animated cartoon and are extremely unwieldy, requiring many signs for an infinity of data and operations of social action. That's why they're kind of difficult to use. In contrast, the phonetic alphabet, by a few letters only, was able to encompass all languages. Such an achievement, however, involved the separation of both signs and sounds from their semantic and dramatic meanings. No other system of writing has accomplished this feat. And how does that separate us? He says, to understand such effects, it's necessary to see literacy as a typographic technology applied not only to the rationalization of entire procedures and marketing, but to law and education and city planning. The principles of continuity, uniformity, and repeatability derived from print technology have, in England and America, long permeated every phase of communal life. So here's where, like, the entire idea of replication and automation, that not only means we can manufacture products, but that's the stamp of your entire being. Another example he gives here is literate people tend to think of cause and effect as sequential, as if one thing pushed another by physical force. Non-literate people register very little interest in this kind of efficient cause and effect, but are fascinated by hidden forms that produce magical results, inner rather than outer. And this is why the literate West sees the rest of the world as caught up in a seamless web of superstition. This kind of runs counter to what he was saying before, because he'll alternate occasionally in the book by saying that the non-literate world is superior to the literate mind, or very obviously caught up in a web of just magic and superstition. And he gives an example of the machine. He says, as contrasted with the mere tool, because a tool or a media is an extension of a sense or an action, the machine is an extension or outering of an entire process, a complex sequence. The tool extends the fists, the nails, the teeth, the arms. The wheel extends the feet in rotation and sequential movement. Printing, the first complete mechanization of a handicraft, breaks up the movement of the hand into a series of discrete steps that are repeatable. From this analytic sequence came the assembly line principle, but the assembly line is now obsolete in the electric age because synchronization is no longer sequential. By electric tapes, synchronization of any number of different acts can be simultaneous. plurality of times succeeds uniformity of time. And that's just another example of what I was saying before about the simultaneousness of this existence that I still think we're trying to, I said this before, that the ideologies that we're most familiar with, this would be liberalism, fascism and communism, Marxism, that emerged in my mind from liberalism as responses to it. They it's like if you read Marx and you read a lot of these early communist thinkers, it seems that their thinking was so tied to the Industrial Revolution and awareness of commodity markets and capital and whatnot. But that was very much of its time, and by still having a fascination and trying to employ these ideologies, we are trying to employ an Industrial Revolution styled ideology in a cybernetic world. That's why fascism and communism struggle to map onto our lived experience now, because they're very process driven. It's very, I don't want to say reductive, but somewhat low resolution compared to our awareness of how things functions now. And I had said that there's been no ideology, even if you don't like ideology, I don't give a shit, but you're aware that ideologies emerge from various constraints, historical periods and whatnot. I don't think there's been one ideology or one comprehensive reaction to the information age or the cybernetic age. Maybe like this is as close as you get, and sometimes you get like the techno futurist type stuff, but even then it's kind of cartoony. It doesn't feel like a full-fledged intellectual reaction or an addressing of how like the information revolution has fucking broken our minds, and we're still picking up the pieces right now. And more than anything, that could be the response for so many people like depressed and losing their minds as well. And before, when we were talking about implosion, there was this concept of like, what's the difference between an explosion of technology versus sort of this metaphysical implosion that technology caused. He said the implosion of the electric age is the separation. He said, in the implosion of the electric age, the separation of thought and feeling has come to seem as strange as the departmentalization of knowledge in schools and universities. It was precisely the power to separate thought and feeling and to be able to act without reciting that split literate man out of the tribal world of close family bonds and private and social life. So that's what's interesting. Like, the technology doesn't actually increase your boundaries. It's kind of collapsing you back into this familiar world of interconnectivity. And we're constantly sort of oscillating between those two beliefs of what's actually happening. And he says it here: education is ideally the civil defense against media fallout, yet Western man has had so far no education or equipment for meeting any of the new media on their own terms. Literate man is not only numb and vague in the presence of film or video, but he intensifies his ineptness by a defensive arrogance and condensation to pop culture and mass entertainment. It was this spirit of bulldog opacity that the scholastic philosophers failed to meet the challenge of the printed book in the 16th century. All meaning alters with acceleration, because all patterns of personal and political interdependence change with any acceleration of information. And one point he makes here, as the speed of information increases, like we just said, the tendency is for politics to move away from representation and delegation of constituents towards immediate involvement of the entire community in the central acts of decision. When the electric speed is introduced into such a delegated organization, the organization can only be made to function by a series of subterfuges and makeshifts. These strike some observers as base betrayals of the original aims and purposes of the established forms. And I guess that's a point I love, that, politics used to be more of a one-to-one relationship, but the idea that a politician they don't really give a shit about their individual constituents. They give a shit about sort of this concept of the abstract public that they can interface with directly, instantaneously, through media manipulation or analysis or graphs or whatever. So like the public, the people, have necessarily been abstracted by electricity. So politicians, they don't give a shit about people, they give a shit about graphs. And that's how that happened. It's just as much to do with the instantaneous information as it is like their distance physically from the people. He says, to the student of media, it is difficult to explain the human indifference to social effects of these radical forces. The phonetic alphabet and the printed word that exploded the closed tribal world into the open society of fragmented functions and specialist knowledge and action have never been studied in their roles as a magical transformer. The antithetic electric power of instant information that reverses social explosion into implosion, private enterprise into organized man, and expanding empires into common markets has attained as little recognition as the written word. The power of radio to retribalize mankind, its almost instant reversal of individualism into collectivism, fascist or Marxist, has gone unnoticed. There's a few things. I'll just end with this because there's a lot we could talk about. I know we got to get going soon. I think I've covered a lot of what I wanted to cover. It says, if delegated chain of command authority won't work by telephone but only by written instruction, what sort of authority does come into play? On the telephone, only the authority of knowledge will work. Delegated authority is linear, visual, and hierarchical. The authority of knowledge is nonlinear, non-visual, and inclusive. And he breaks it down here how the medium kind of breaks down these walls. He says the telephone is speech without walls. The phonograph is the music hall without walls. The photograph is the museum without walls. The electric light is space without walls. The movie, radio, and TV is a classroom without walls. And man, the food gatherer, reappears incongruously as an information gatherer. So I talked about a lot. There's a lot that I gave you right there. Some of it's been discussed in previous episodes. I'm curious to hear. I know we have to get going soon, but what are your thoughts on all of that? I know I threw a lot at you, and a lot of it might have sounded a bit obtuse, but what do you think?
It is a lot. I think what you'd said at the beginning, that people don't generally understand the depth of medium is the message, and I feel like I'm grasping it a little bit more now, especially as it relates to things we were talking about before, about like I think it was last episode or on the stream, about that people don't have the mental machinery to even understand certain concepts until you teach them something. So based on the way that people's cultures work and their languages work, a certain media with the same like objective message can have a totally different impact on that person. So it's there's a lot going on there. I mean, to say the least.
Because the interplay, once again, it's like, okay, what is speech? Literacy, the written word, is a carrier for speech. That is the medium. But that medium necessarily changes speech itself, and it changes who is writing it as well. So it's this like constant feedback loop of development. And that's more the relationship he's talking about, that a media is just an extension of something of the body. That's where it starts with. And maybe some people disagree with that, but that's the framework that he's using. So, and every extension we do, that uses to extend our sight, our sound, our touch, feel, whatever, anything that is trying to either protect or amplify the human body, it simultaneously numbs it, but also changes our understanding of it and our understanding of ourselves. And also it's unavoidable. You know what I mean? And it's like, this isn't something that you get to, once you're aware of radio, it'll have a profound effect on you. And just like electricity, like you don't know how much the electrical or the information revolution changed how you think, about how you think processes operate. And we have such a dynamic understanding of the interconnectivity of things that might not have been apparent to people centuries ago. Not to say that they're stupid, not to say that it's an IQ thing, not that they're like cavemen, but it's just a different way to view the world that I don't think has really been acknowledged by anyone, really. And this was written by Marshall McLuhan how many decades ago, but still, we still grapple with 21st century ideas with 20th century language, and we're trying to grasp the information revolution with industrial revolution concepts. I think that's why there's this tension there. Anyway, I'm just going to end up repeating myself. I know we got to get going.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.